Why has Meeta stopped being on those calls? I didn't even follow that.
What WhatsApp? Remember that privacy issues WhatsApp had with
Hello and welcome to the second season of Sunday Stories Live, brought to you by the 1947 Partition Archive, a global non-profit, non-governmental organization that works tirelessly to preserve the nearly lost oral histories of the partition and has documented the life stories of more than 9,700 witnesses to the South Asian partition of 1947. The Oral History Project is the largest of its kind in South Asia. And with passion and dedication, they have made it possible to preserve unique stories in about 750 different cities and villages across 18 countries. Sunday Stories is a unique event series that will bring to you academics, scholars, oral historians, graphic novelists, musicians, and people's personal stories of the partition. Like the name suggests, it will take place every Sunday at the same time. So please be sure to tune in. My name is Sonam Kalra. I am a musician with my own personal interest and body of work on partition. And today I'm in conversation with a very, very special guest who is an Indian graphic novelist, illustrator, and now a podcaster, Vishwajyoti Ghosh. Working with visuals, comics, illustrations, Vishwajyoti Ghosh works on his stories through multiple mediums. Stories of our everyday lives, extraordinary stories from our everyday lives. His graphic novel, Delhi Calm, was published in 2010. The graphic novel blends realistic comic passages with political commentaries and fantastical elements in order to remember a particularly incisive and controversially discussed period from 1975 to 1977, referred to in India as the emergency. In 2013, he curated what you just saw, this beautiful book, This Side, That Side, Restoring Partition, the book that we will be discussing today, an anthology of graphic narratives by 48 illustrators, actually 47 plus Vishwa, illustrators and authors from Southern Asia on the partition of the Indian subcontinent. Joe Sacre, the pioneer of modern comic reporting, described the book as beautiful, moving, and unforgettable. Working with stories across platforms, Vishwa now divides his time between drawing stories and podcasting stories. His podcast, Kissa Stories, is now his latest endeavor to spread out moving stories from our otherwise ordinary lives. And also, very, very special to me this time with this guest is that Vishwa, as I call him, is a dear, dear friend, an old friend, and I'm not referring to his age. Vishwa and I went to college together, and I have stories about him, so many stories that perhaps I could make it into a novel. But I won't do that today. Vishwa, I'm so glad to be doing this with you today. Welcome to Sunday Stories. So,
Thank
Vishwa,
you. It's lovely being here. Thank you.
yeah.
And
And you'll have difficulty getting any sort of a word in edgeways because this is you and me talking, or maybe we'll be overlapping, but that's what's going to be so special about this conversation.
mm,
Vishwa, you and I have spoken about this book so many times. The very title of your book, This Side, That Side, has always been something that I found so captivating. It says so much, so simply. It captures what is between India and Pakistan, this side, that side, and yet it tells two sides of a story. And I loved the way you wrote that in my afterlife, if there is an afterlife, I want to come back as a river so that I can come to you at any time. But there's so much poignancy. I get goosebumps as I speak to you. I want you to share with all of us. Tell me
I,
what made you to do this book. What was the inspiration? Elaborate on your process. Just everything. Dig deep.
I think the book is called This Side, That Side is because we know so little about the other side. Ever since the partition, there's been such an opaque wall from both sides that it
Yeah.
is a mandate not to know about the other. But the book was what attempting to do is actually open the other side and open the life on the other side, more than actually just talk about partition. So the onus of the book was to talk about partition and how our generation or the third generation of partition has actually processed it and retold it and worked around it, because you and I both come from partition families. We live in Delhi. You cannot miss a partition story. Every kid in the block was probably a partition kid, and every time, and there was partition in everything we did, whether it was about food, whether it was about common stories or places or somewhere or the other, a place or a town would always come back. So someone would say Gujranwala ke chole bhature, and someone would say, Rawalpindi ke kachori. So that would always come up, and that's part of being in Delhi, growing up in Delhi. So for me, what was interesting was actually to open up to the other side, and not only and partition is not only about India and Pakistan; it's also about Bangladesh, which we often forget.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So and that's a country that's got partition twice. So for me, the interesting part was that
Three times.
I being for me, I being a Bengali in Delhi, coming from a Bengali refugee family, so I've seen partition and I've seen stories from both the sides. So for me, it was important to connect both the sides in this book. That was number one. The other point, the onus was, besides restoring it, which was inventing a new word, but also it was to open up the perspectives of partition from the other side. We never know what partition from the other side, what was their perspective about it. We have only
Right.
our take of partition is either through our grandparents or through the school history books. So the processing has always been there has been a certain oral history and certain official history. And somewhere in
Right.
the middle, we have figured out our own partitions. But what is it for the other side? What is it for the families that decided to move? Or what is the family that was forced to move? Or the family that never moved? So how did they process? So for me, it was a mix of both. So the book actually came about. The idea came about from the publisher Arpita Das from Yoda Press, and she said, "I'm thinking of a book. Would you like to do it?" So I said, "Yeah, I'm the best guy to do it because these are the stories I've always lived with."
Yeah.
So yeah. So and then what we did was we opened up a call for entry. So we knew we will only get that many number of stories and only our kind of stories. So we put up an open call for entry in the public domain, and a lot of people sent their stories. So a lot of stories were about the house we left or the train burning and all the kind of narratives that we have grown up with. So the idea was to go beyond that and see if there's something we can dig more of the lived history.
Right.
That's how it started. That's how the process started, and yes, and it just opened up so many references we could have never found on our own. So there are many stories, and the interesting part was that graphic novel as a form is a very nascent form in this part of the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's even more unheard of in Pakistan or Bangladesh. So we went out looking for stories, but we also did a few workshops with a lot of artists and illustrators, how to work on it. But we also opened up to people who had not worked with graphic novels. So the big hunch of a lot of people was that, oh, comics, so that means you're going to trivialize it, or you're going to make it for
Right.
children, or it's going to be funny. Uh, well, we said you have to deal with the form of graphic novel. So there were some PhD papers that came through, and but they were apprehensive. They wanted to be published it as it is. So we had to tell them, and we had to work around them. We also had Rabbi Shergill, the musician, who lent
Yeah.
a song to convert it visually. We had a dastan go converted into a this thing, and it was a bit of a mixture of processing the story and then also putting up making the collaborations. Since we were talking about India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, I thought it would be a great idea to put one illustrator and one writer from different parts and throw them
Mm-hmm.
into a room and then let them
Nice.
work around it.
Yeah.
So it was actually a blind date. It was actually a blind date. So so there are people who actually interacted with them with each other very closely, and some of them didn't. They never even
Okay.
spoke to each other, and
Wow.
yeah, and some of them even ended fighting with each other, which is any creative collaboration that does.
Right. Of
But it was
course.
interesting. But it was interesting the way they processed their stories, and that's where the cultural games start playing. That's where you realize, okay, this is how you see it, and probably
This
it
is how
didn't
they
have to
see
be
it.
that way. Yeah,
Yeah. But that
yeah.
must have been incredible. Did you video that just out of curiosity? Because that would have been a whole other story in itself. I mean, these collaborations and the processes. I mean, that would make for another book almost, I think.
That would almost make for another book because but most of it was online. Most of it was online,
That's
and
incredible.
but it was also playing. It was also an exposure to our cultural stereotypes we have about
Right.
each other. Even
Right.
we are, even if I'm be the most coolest thing, and we will interact with each other over a cricket match, but the inherited cultural stereotypes we have, that it was an exposure. I'll give you a small example.
I
So
was
there
just
was
going to
a,
ask, yeah.
so there was an example that there was this illustrator from Delhi, and there was a writer from Pakistan, and he was talking about his story of coming to Amritsar and looking for his wife's house or a family or
Hmm.
whatever. And the illustrator interacted fairly well,
Hmm.
and but just forgot to I think mention, or the writer forgot to mention about his wife or how she looked. So he had a proper hijab oriented woman with the real sketch of this guy in walking around in the streets of Amritsar, until I actually met her in Lahore. I mean, she was a short haired, hardcore feminist, and she looked at the picture and she said, "Is that me?" I mean, she wanted to kill me. I
Yeah, I
said,
can imagine. I can imagine.
well, so I cooked up a story. So,
Which you're very good at, yes.
so these are cultural stereotypes, and I'm like, gosh, even I didn't think about it. There was another story from Bangladesh, and it was a story about this Bangladeshi writer, his family trying to escape from Pakistan once Bangladesh was made.
Hmm.
And he was collaborating with a Bengali illustrator from Calcutta. And so there was and when he got the book, and he said, "I didn't write this part. Who wrote that part?" So we said, well, I thought you guys were collaborating. And he said,
Right.
there's a scene where they're having mutton the last night before they're trying to flee out from Pakistan. And he said, so we got a limited quota. And this guy said, what is the quota? I'm having my dinner. Where's the quota of mutton? But in Bengali households, mutton comes only on Sundays, and there's a particular quota to everyone.
Okay. Right.
So it
That's how
was
it was.
actually it was a cultural
No, but
presumption on the other.
Vishwa, when you said earlier that you found that, you wanted to go beyond just the stories of we left our homes and, we had to flee overnight. Tell me some of those stories that you found as well, which were really the ones that made it to the book or that really were so different and things that we hadn't actually heard of so much. Can you remember something?
Yeah, so one was this particular story about this family that's working in Pakistan. So a lot of Bangladesh, the East Pakistanis were actually working in Pakistan, and
Mm.
overnight they heard, okay, now this is going to be a separate country. They knew it's going to happen, but overnight when this comes like a katak, and which your
Right.
grandfather was a part of, and
Don't make it sound bad. He got General Niazi to surrender.
surrender.
Just
So
for
that
those of you
night,
watching that, yeah, General Arora got General Niazi to sign the declaration of surrender. He wasn't responsible for the axing, Vishwa, as you make it sound.
and
Yeah.
General Arora is Sonam's grandfather. So
And
anyway,
he's the
so that
reason you became my friend in college as well. Please
yeah.
tell the audience that.
Oh
That's the only
yes,
reason
yes.
you chose to become my friend.
Oh yeah. When I knew that this is Aurora's granddaughter, I said, stay away. So yeah. So
Yeah.
so this is the night when the Niazi agreement is being signed on, and they realize they have to flee now.
Hmm.
So they get a middleman who organizes everything, and they say, okay, from this particular station you have to go and buy these tickets, and this train will take you out.
Right.
And they send a kid, and they ask him to buy 47 tickets. Now, who on earth buys 47 tickets together?
Right.
So obviously the guy knew that these guys are fleeing out. So
Right.
the guy was very good, and he says, don't be an idiot. Don't buy 47 tickets. And even if you buy, don't tell anyone. So he gave them those 47 tickets, but says, just shut up till the rest of your life. And then they made it out. So this was a fantastic story. I never thought of a story that way,
So
that
rather
Pakistan.
strange. Isn't it strange
Yeah.
that it was 47 tickets? I mean, in 1947,
Yeah.
but You know, what you're
No,
also
this
saying is
this
something
is
that both.
1970s. No, this is 1971. So yeah,
Oh, this is the
but
71. But
this is 70.
previously, two of the speakers we've had, Professor Gandhi and Professor Mahajan, have also reiterated, and what you're saying as well, they've reiterated how people helped each other. So, contrary to what
Yeah.
you all think of the bloodshed, there were many, many groups of people who were helping each other, exactly like here, the ticket collector or the person selling the tickets,
Yeah.
saying that be careful. Coming back
Hmm.
to your specifically, when you talk of these collaborations, I don't think perhaps the audience even realizes how many people, when you say it was an open call for entries, how many people you had? 47 plus you had 47 people working on this book. How did you even manage the logistics of that? What were the challenges you faced? And what was it that you really, that really
Hmm.
stayed with you, and you think that it couldn't have been done any other way, perhaps?
I think the biggest learning was this to learn about the sameness of our differences. You know, how life in Lahore is no different from life in Delhi, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And life in Calcutta is can be very similar and dissimilar to life in Dhaka. So that was the biggest learning. And I have been to Lahore, and so have you. Uh, I mean, I feel so at home there. I just feel so at home over there, and I can actually. There have been places where I have passed on myself as someone from Karachi because I was trying to ask a very obvious address. Because my Urdu and my Hindi is perfectly okay for me to actually navigate Lahore. So for me, that was a revelation. That was a big revelation to understand the fact that that opaque wall that is there. There's equal amount of curiosity from both sides to learn about each other.
Right, right.
um, Food being one, culture being one, our clothes being one, and the huge amount of cultural curiosity people have. So if I go to Lahore and tell my friends, they will give me a big shopping list. But if I go tell my friends from Lahore that I'm coming, they will give me an equally big shopping
Big
list.
shopping list. No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember when I went to Lahore and I was staying with a friend, the lady who was helping at her home, she was a part time worker. And I'd been a few times, so I knew the live in staff. But the lady who was the part time worker actually walked up to me and she looked new. And I said, Aapse nahi mile pehle. And she came to me and she just touched my face and she said, आप इंडिया से आए हैं ना बस आपकी शक्ल देखनी थी, and it brought tears to my eyes. So I know exactly what
Mm.
you're saying. I'm just going to remind those who've just joined that you're watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. This is season 2, and with us is our third very esteemed guest on this season, graphic novelist and podcaster Vishwajyoti Ghosh. And Vishwa, I'm now going to ask you, even in college, I remember so clearly, you had this incredible style of storytelling. One never knew if you were telling the truth or making up a story, but it was a storytelling style that was so your own, and you had this incredible style of illustration, which I was a big fan of and still am. What I love so much is that now you have taken it from our lighter days in college to now using it to preserve
Mm.
memory, humanity,
Mm.
and the quality of compassion. So for me, that's incredible. But if I wanted to ask you, between all your work that you've done and your previous book, Delhi Come, and this side, that side, what is it that is a common theme in all of your work?
Well, to tell you the truth, I mean, I would like I just find this whole common theme. I mean, just find this whole everyday life an endless pit of stories, and that's what makes life pretty interesting. Especially with partition stories. The thing is that you have heard one story and you say, "Wow, that's moved me. That's going to be the next big story of my life." But then you
Okay.
hear the next one, and then you say, "Oh, no, 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 hang on." I mean, so each story is as moving or even more moving than the other. And growing up in Delhi, we have all grown up with these stories. I grew up in Lajpat Nagar, which was a partition colony. I
Refugee
grew up,
colonies.
yeah, and then I went to college. I went to school, and there were partition kids all over the place. So I just find it every time a story is told, a partition story is told, I find it's a translation itself from one generation to the other. Every story itself is a memoir in itself, and then it just opens a whole new bank of stories. I mean, being in Delhi, we are still, I think, cut away from it. I mean, think about it. Till the 70s, most of the friends of Lahore, they would go to Amritsar for a film and then they would cycle back,
Yeah.
which is so incredible. Which is
Yeah,
so
because it's that
incredible.
close. It's that
It's that
close,
close.
literally.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
actually, the carpenters would come from Lahore to Amritsar, and the plumbers would go from Amritsar to Lahore. I mean, that's how trade happened for a whole long time. It's
Right.
so the borders were so open. I mean, you can take a cycle and you can move from France to Germany just crossing a river. I mean, but we can't do that. You've crossed Wagah, I've crossed Wagah. It becomes a
What was that like
cultural.
for you? What was that like when you actually, because I know what it felt like for me, but what did it feel like for you when you have that there's that definitive moment, right? When you have one foot on either side and there's that lakir in the middle. I know for me what it felt, but what did it feel like for you? Because I would love to hear in your own words what went through your head at that moment.
I took the Wagah border for the second time. The first time was a rather sanitized flight that I took.
Same,
So for
yeah.
me, it was, yeah. But
Yeah.
actually, the moving part was when I took the bus, and the whole thing, it opened a new world for me. I mean, a lot of the people who were going back from Delhi to Lahore were actually medical tourists taking a lot of stuff. They had all paid for excess baggage because they had taken the whole Delhi with them. And then the bus wala said, yeah, please, I can't accommodate so much.
Yeah.
And we were carrying books and all of that, and crossing Wagah border at the thing, and we were going there for the Lahore Literature Festival. So there was an equal amount of curiosity from the Indian border and who is coming for the festival.
Right.
So just to get this guy off my back, I said, we are on this bus today, but I think Javed and Shabana are also coming in the next trip. And then there was like all over the place.
Right.
And at the literature festival, someone told me, I have heard Javed and Shabana are coming. So I said, did you hear it at the Wagah border? He
Hit
said,
the
yes.
bus,
I,
yes.
I said, well, I mean,
That's very funny.
so,
Yeah.
it's the same amount of cultural curiosity. And this is what I love. And it just makes you feel at home.
This
And
cultural curiosity. Sorry, I mean, I have, like I said, I have known you for years. With other guests, I wouldn't interrupt like this, but with you, I will. This cultural curiosity, I love the term. I love the term because it symbolizes so much of a love and a genuine desire to know each other. So tell me, when you were at the Lit Fest, what were the questions you got asked in terms of the cultural curiosity? What were the stereotypes that people perhaps put out at you and said, बताएं कि क्या ये सचमुच में ऐसा है यहाँ पे कि ऐसा होता है? What do you
uh,
see, even with your book, the reaction? You know what I mean?
yeah. Before the book, I think there was a lot of street curiosity that actually addressed. अच्छा आप हिंदू हैं आप मटन खाते हैं so I said हम मटन ही खाएंगे अगर लाहौर आए हैं तो
बिल्कुल.
and I mean Bengali I mean give me my mutton so it is from there then the range is diverse. It's like what is the latest film Shah Rukh Khan is working on, or what is
Right.
the so a lot of my friends actually who are into cricket in Delhi, and there's this very close friend of mine. He's made it a mission for me to go and check out Lahore Cricket Academy. I was like, okay, if you really
Wow.
want me to do,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and
But isn't
some
that so
people.
lovely? That's so
That's so
lovely.
lovely. That's so lovely because a lot of friends actually give you addresses for you to visit. This is my house, or this is the address
Ah, see what
so
it's
please
like.
go
Bring
and
me a photograph.
yeah, and yeah, bring me a photograph. So this editor of mine was going with me, and she went around looking for that house till I told her finally the trick that when you go for looking for a partition house, finally if you don't make it, take the
Just
next
again.
appropriate house and make it your own and live with
Terrible.
it in your memory.
Terrible. Therefore,
Live
you
with
are
it
a
in your memory.
storyteller. Therefore, you are a storyteller. You told all these people to go back with the wrong photograph. But what also, you and I were talking yesterday, or was it the day before, about the fact that this whole cultural curiosity of Indians watching the Pakistani dramas, the Pakistanis watching Indian movies. What were the stories you were sharing? You were sharing a very interesting story. Do you remember about a stereotype
Yeah,
that
yeah. Because there's a lot. The Hindi film is big in Lahore and Pakistan. But equally big, if you remember, were the dramas, the Pakistani theater which used to come in video cassettes in our childhood in
Right.
the
Yeah.
80s, right? And they would
Dhoop
be
Chao. Dhoop
Dhoop
Chao was one
Chow,
of
and
them,
then
yes.
yeah, and there were a
I
couple
remember
of
there
them.
was another one, yeah. There was
Yeah,
a really popular other
remember
one.
Buddha Ghar Pe Hai, that something that there was a
Yeah.
line like
And
that that
there was
really
a
went
character
wrong.
called Zoya, and there was a gentleman who was a very good looking Pakistani man who looked like their version of Amitabh Bachchan. I remember, but I don't
Something
remember what
like
it was
that,
called.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
But interestingly, when I was there, Z was also doing a rerun of Pakistani shows in India at that point of time, which became a big hit.
Okay.
Uh, so the thing is that what happens is that a lot of TV serials also get watched in Pakistan, vice
Yeah,
versa,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Like Ramayan was big time watched
That
from
is so
Amritsar.
interesting.
Yeah,
Really.
Ramayan was watched big time during its airing days in Doordarshan, and they
You mean
would
on
actually catch
Lahore?
in
It
Lahore.
was watched on. That is fantastic. Yeah.
They would catch from the waves from Amritsar. I mean,
But
it's
that
just
is
half
so
an hour away.
special. That is fantastic to hear, right? And
That's so
it totally
fantastic.
breaks down every one of the walls, as you said, the opaque
All the
walls created
walls that
by
are there.
politics, because these are just people watching on a basic level of humanity and oneness and
Yeah,
people of the same land. And I know we're talking a lot of Punjab, and Punjab has got a lot of mileage, perhaps because it
yeah.
was the most photographed. And it
Mm,
Bunyad, thank you, Farah. See, she's
mm.
just Farah Usman has told us that it's Bunyad and she's from
And Dhoop
Pakistan.
Kinare. Yeah, Dhoop
Right, Dhoop
Kinare.
Kinare,
Dhoop
not Dhoop
Kinare, yeah.
Chha. Thank you, Bhavna.
Yeah.
But Pakistan got a lot of,
Hmm.
we'll say, focus because it was photographed at
Bakra
the
Kish
time, and
Cafe. Yeah, yeah.
some of the world's best photographers were in India at the time of 47. But so much is said on the partition of Punjab, but not enough, I feel, is said about the partition of Bengal, which I understand, as you just mentioned, it was partitioned not two but three times: 1905, 1947, 1971, when my grandfather had General Niazi sign the Declaration of Surrender. But why don't we talk about it enough? Why do you think that is the case? And also in your book and through the stories and the open call that you got, what were the stories that you heard about Bangladesh? Share those with us.
Very interesting because I have traveled to Bangladesh and I have gone and located my own house there. And
Wow.
even locating my own house is actually a bit of guesswork. So one will have to live with that. My thing is
Right.
I've been to Bangladesh multiple number of times because of work. So the thing with Bangladesh in terms of the partition narrative is also because a lot of the work that happened is in terms of literature
Hmm.
that happened in Pakistan and Urdu and Hindi here, whether it was Rajinder
Right.
Singh Bedi and Ismat Chugtai and all the and Manto, of course, being
Right.
seminal
Of course.
work of partition. Uh, that amount of work probably did not happen, but equal amount of work that might have happened did not get translated that much in terms of Bangladesh literature or Indian Bengali literature.
Right.
Is one of the reasons. Also, that the exodus itself was a big thing for the government of the day to accommodate in cities like Amritsar and Delhi, vis-a-vis places like Calcutta and all that. What is even not even lesser talked about is the migration of the Biharis to Pakistan.
Okay.
Okay,
That's
so that
interesting.
is a
Yeah.
very interesting story because a lot of the Biharis, and there's a story in the book. So the Biharis went from Bihar to Pakistan, to Bangladesh, which was then Pakistan. Okay, and then Bangladesh happens, but they don't want to be in Bangladesh. They had come to this land with the idea of going to Pakistan because they're not Bengali. They're actually non-Bengali Muslims.
Right.
So
Right.
they want to be identified with the concept of Pakistan. Now what
Right.
happens is India, they've moved out from India. There's a new country called Bangladesh, which doesn't want them because they didn't come to Bangladesh. They actually came from Pakistan. And then Pakistan doesn't want them. Okay? So they're actually they're nowhere men
No man's land and nowhere
and in a
people.
no
Right.
man's land. Yeah. So
Right.
till date, they call themselves stranded Pakistanis. It's only in the
Really.
last 15, 20 years they have actually got a working permit and all of that. So imagine they have been actually
Gosh.
waiting for an identity
So
for the
many
last
years.
70 years.
Unbelievable. That's
So
crazy.
these are the untold and these are the unfinished stories of partition,
So I
which
really think that
still exist here.
I really think that should be your next book, called The Unfinished Stories of Partition, because honestly, there are so many stories that all of us haven't heard. We spend our lives
Mm.
learning history. Even in the education system, it's taught just by rote, it's taught in a very academic way. These oral histories, which the 1947 Partition Archive is preserving, which, graphic novelist, writers like you, oral historians are bringing to the front, these are the ones that I think all of us need to pass down to the generations to ensure that, to show many things, that this never happens again, this kind of bloodshed, and to understand friendships, to understand different perspectives. And speaking of different perspectives, when we were talking again day before, we were talking about this side, that side, you mentioned some really interesting things, and perceptions, on
Yeah.
perception on one side and perception on another side, how those things were different, and share those with me as well. What we see as something may be different to someone else.
The thing is with even like a concept like partition. I mean, thing is, see, one is the historical rendition of it, which we are put in a school curriculum, and then we take it and pass it on to the next generation. The other part is the oral histories also give you a certain perspective, which you also negotiate with in your family and all that. You might not be speaking about it outside. Same is it with partition. So what's partition for us is Batwara for many who have lived there. Right, for them it was azadi. It was azadi for them,
And
and it was
freedom for us.
batwara and freedom for us. And
Right.
and it's batwara for people who have actually moved from this part of the country to that part of the newly formed nation. So there are three different perspectives on partition. So it's azadi for someone, it's batwara for someone, right? And same is it with locking of your memory. So national memories get locked with national timelines. For us, history begins with Indus Valley civilization,
Yes.
right?
Right.
But for Bangladesh, for many people that I've spoken to, it doesn't actually begin between before 1971 or something. Culturally, we are always there. There's Tagore, who's common. There's Bengali culture, which is common across. But there's a certain national making of a national memory that happens with the national timeline. And same with it with Pakistan. Before 47, Azadi se pehle, it was this, and now it's this. So there's a big museum in Lahore. Now there are artifacts, or there are souvenirs or objects from the Buddha's age, or whatever,
Time.
So how do they appropriate that? That's very interesting. How do they appropriate pre-47 history?
Gautam
How
Budh,
does
right.
Bangladesh? Yeah, how does Bangladesh appropriate pre-47 history? There's a Gurdwara in Dhaka, right? Now Guru Nanak Sahib went to Dhaka, right?
Right.
So there are ragis who actually travel from the Calcutta Gurdwaras every month, and then they go and sing there, and then they stay there, and then they come back. Okay, so now that's also a cultural negotiation. But how is the rest of the society negotiating with them? Is it an island within the city which no one else
Or is
goes
it
to?
inclusive, or is it inclusive?
Or is it inclusive? So those are actually the unfinished stories of partition, which one constantly deals with.
But I think
I
Please go ahead.
identified there were some 10 places. There are some 10 places which are there in Delhi and in Lahore. That could be a Sadiq Nagar. There could be of course, there'll be a model town or a civil lines, which are particularly British colonial constructs. But there's a Delhi Gate. But there's a Gangaram Hospital here, and there's a Gangaram Hospital there as well. So those kind of common linkages have to be connected time and again. Those walls can't be created.
And I think these common linkages can't be broken, as you are saying. And 70 years has reiterated that these common links cannot be broken. But we constantly still live. And I mean, the reason I talk of unfinished stories, and I say that not in jest, actually, when you should write that book, perhaps. But I just think that there is so much left unsaid. There's so much left unfinished. There are so many scars that so many generations are dealing with. And one of the questions I will ask you will be about that. But right now, I just want to remind everyone who've just joined that this is the Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. This is season 2. And in case you're wondering who this super interesting person is that I'm speaking to, our second guest is Vishwajyoti Ghosh. She's a graphic novelist and now a podcaster. He does this incredible podcast called Kissa Stories. So please find it. Listen to all the stories he has to share, everyday stories. everyday stories from our extraordinary lives or extraordinary stories from our everyday lives, whichever way you look at it. Vishwa will find a way to make it interesting because he's such a great storyteller. Now, Vishwa, you and I both, we come from partition families. And when I say partition families, my ancestors are from Sargodha, Rawalpindi. Yours are from Bangladesh. And we've both worked on partition through our own art forms. And
Yeah.
share some of the stories. I mean, what I think we both found, and we've just been talking about those stories, we both found that what really drew us to this was these unfinished stories, was these stories that still every time you hear a story that you think is the best story, you want to hear another. And, I just feel like since you have such an incredible wealth of stories, and you would have through the open call heard so many and through all your travels, and because you're a storyteller, you just draw them out of people. I want to know, share some of the stories that really moved you and touched you and just stayed with you.
One thing that has also happened is the with the unfinished stories is our own negotiation and the forgetting, the art of the whole art of we have also learned the art of not remembering, maybe, which is not forgetting. Similarly,
Blocking
similar to
out,
the
perhaps.
blocking out.
Yeah.
Because of whatever pressures that we are in. But what is also getting lost is the range of languages that is
Hmm.
happening. So there is Multani, there's Saraiki, there is all of that.
Sarai,
All
yes.
those languages are getting lost. Similarly, from the Bangladesh side, there's the people of Chittagong and the people of Sylhet, different languages. Those are getting lost. Those dialects are getting lost. That negotiation for me is very important to be continued. I mean, what has
Hmm.
happened is national languages have overtaken a lot of the regional languages, and those regional
As a
languages have
result, a
not got
wealth of
blocked.
poetry. Yeah, wealth of
Yeah,
poetry, wealth of stories. Saraiki, as you said, so many of the greatest poets wrote in Saraiki and,
yeah.
Multani. Those stories must be
Those stories must be
treasured.
told, and it's not, and it's a misnomer to say that those languages are only on one part of the border, because of the partition, the refugees moving in and out, the languages exist on both sides of the border. So there are people, as many people of speaking Saraiki in Delhi today,
Hmm.
uh, as many on the other side, right? And
Yeah.
similarly for Bangladesh, for Bengal, the language, the dialects, it's the same there, that way. So those stories, those languages somehow need to be negotiated in our daily lives, which we are forgetting on the official sheen kind of a thing. Uh, what is interesting is also how negotiated languages, for me, languages have become. Balraj Sani, I remember, had a very interesting take on this in a lecture that he had given in JNU, probably in late 60s or something, where he talked about languages and the officialization of these languages. So he said, like a language like Urdu, which is actually spoken on the streets of whole of northern India, but also
Right.
on the other side of the border, right? Now what
Yeah.
happens is, now All India Radio wants to make Urdu its own, so they put in a lot of Sanskrit words in it, and
Yeah.
and the Pakistan radio wants to make it its own, so they put a lot of Farsi words in it.
Right.
Now that's
Right.
actually the politics of language that is happening, while the man on the street is actually speaking everyday Urdu,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Same as it with the same as it with Bangla. So the whole thing is, these languages have to be preserved in our everyday stories, which I think is one big unfinished story of partition.
Yeah.
Talking about
Yeah.
particularly about stories is this particular story from Bangladesh about this man who keeps dreaming, and this is a real story,
Hmm.
that he keeps dreaming about this place that he has to go back to, and he has to go back to, and he never goes. And then he starts writing about these places in Bangladesh, which are now currently in Bangladesh, and he keeps writing about them. And finally, he meets this young poet from Bangladesh who's actually a big fan, and there's the fanboy moment happening, and he shares his poems with him, and he says, "But have you ever been to these places?" He says, "No, and probably because of my health, I never will." So then, how do you write about these places? So he says, "That's what makes me a poet." And I think that's so beautiful.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
That's so
Yeah.
beautiful of
From his imagination. Yeah. Yeah.
he's appropriating those places, he's appropriating partition, and he's doing his work. I mean, he's not giving it away, which I think that is beautiful about the partition. Similarly, the way we look at news, the way we look at our own cultural stereotypes is very interesting. So there was this student group that came from there was a student group that came from Lahore to Delhi, and they had called me. This was in Hindu college, and they had called me to over there for a talk. And so there was this open house after that, and one of the kids from Hindu had asked them that, what did you think of us when you met us, before you met us, what did you think of us? So this girl from Lahore, brilliant, articulate kid, I mean, brilliant. I mean, she said, I thought that this concept of this Hindu is a very evil and a cunning and a manipulative character. So I said, why? So she said, because my mother keeps watching these Hindi serials and these Saas Bahu serials, and there's this daughter-in-law who's always trying to break a family.
Ekta Kapoor. Yeah.
So she thought every house is like that. Now,
Gosh.
so this is how we carry ourselves, and good that she came here, and it opened out another world for her.
Completely changed your perception. But like you said, it changed your perception when you met your friend, the lady who was the feminist. But you know what? Really, it's of concern a little bit to me, because there have been still...
and a beer in Lahore.
And a beer, okay. And a beer, okay. But Vishwa, what's still of a little concern to me is, whilst there are many authors and poets who write and artists who talk about partition, I still feel there are a lot of silences and on partition. And I don't mean that perhaps from organizations, but from people who just don't want to revisit these stories because they're so traumatic. There's PTSD, there's other issues. Everyone wants to say, "Bas ho gaya, to ab aage dekho." But how do you think the third generation is now processing partition? That's very important, because how will they take it forward? How will they process it? Tell me about what you think.
One of my biggest learning is that whenever it comes to dealing with painful history, what I've learned is that, and seeing this from the families that we come from, and from the families you would know, from the families in Delhi, from the families in Dhaka, everywhere, is that the generation that comes here, okay, doesn't have time to think anymore, right? So they just pull up their socks and get their act together, put their kids in the best school or whatever the school nearest to their house, and they get on with their life. And I think the whole onus was to get a house in Delhi or a house in Dhaka or in Amritsar or wherever, and just move on with their life. Baad mein sochenge, But the second generation was actually too busy setting up that this is my country, this is where I am.
Yeah.
So the whole partition, the whole Delhi economy at one point of time was actually partition economy.
Right.
Whether it was Rajput Nagar or Karol Bagh, it was actually partition economy.
Right.
Having said that, it is actually the third generation that has actually taken the interest and the lead to actually process it and take it forward. So whether it's going up, looking for the history, looking for that suitcase, looking for that certificate, looking for that photograph or whatever, and then digging. So which is one great way. And also what is interesting is that there is nothing called a definite or a true version of history. I mean, history gets appropriated as we go along, right? So if you ask me my family's partition story, my version will be very different from my mother's version.
Right.
And my grandmother's version will be completely different. So last year I was making a few videos with, and that's how memory works, right? That's how memory works.
Of course.
So last year actually I was doing this video with my publisher Arpita, who's here today, and she and her mother were actually talking about a memory, and we were working on this memory of their mother and her grandfather used to be one of the officers looking after the refugees in Purana Killa. And they were talking about one little incident, how the kid gets lost, and Arpita actually gets lost, and one refugee family just grabs her and says, "Ye to meri beti hai."
Oh my God!
She looked so similar, or whatever the emotions were there. Though she actually went through that, and then she had to be explained that no, this is not the way it happened, or not. But when the mother and the daughter in today's day are telling me that story, they actually had two different versions
Different versions of it. How
of the
interesting.
same story. And so, and a lot of the partition archives memories actually work through that. I mean, the archives is doing a fantastic job actually doing that. But I hope there are these conflicts. You know, that is actually the thing. But yes, someone just Bhavya has
I
just
just saw
reminded
that, yeah.
me. This is the story, I think, which will be told till the end of civilization, which is the
Yeah.
story of 90 Upper Mall. So it's actually a story that I had heard in Lahore when I had first visited. And we were talking to this lawyer, Rafi Alam, and he said, for me, the third generation will be how we connect with each other. That will be the take on partition. And I thought that's an interesting take. And so say more. And he said, a few years back this happened. And basically what happened was that his family is a Delhi family. Rafi's family is actually a Delhi family. And they had moved during the partition to Lahore. His grandfather got a transfer, and he was moved to Lahore. But there was this family that was there that moved from Lahore to Delhi. Okay,
Hmm. Hmm.
and the grandsons both meet in London in good enough home, and they are roommates or whatever. And he sees a few pictures. The Delhi guy sees a few pictures on the Lahore's drawing board or whatever, and he says that house looks familiar. He says that's my house in Lahore. He says okay, fine, and he goes back. And then over the time, the penny drops. The Lahori is actually staying in this Delhi guy's grandparents'
House.
house.
Yeah. Yeah, I figured.
Yeah. And so for me, it's like, if you remember, for me, it's like watching a Manmohan Desai film in the 80s. You remember?
Really, yeah.
Amar Akbar Anthony. So they will be, and then in the last scene, there's a stormy night, and there's a blind
Revelation.
mother, and then there's a police,
There's
and
this
there's a
massive
thief.
revelation,
A
yeah.
revelation that the thief and the police are actually the same brothers of the same mother. Uh, a lot of the partition stories are actually
But they
endings
are
like that.
because they are so intrinsically connected. And I mean, I like asked you, why did you do this? Because you're a child
Mm.
of partition. For me, it was something in my DNA as well. And I believe that there is DNA memory. And that is what, causes
Mm.
people like you or me to want to discover more. But I think it's really important what you've just said about the third generation is how we will connect. And that is such a great, wonderful, hopeful way for us to actually move forward. That this side, that side one day just becomes not so etched so harshly as this side, but it's a nicer, softer this side where you can actually go to that side. You know what I mean? So I'm going to ask you Saiful Khan's question. India covered all of the Bangladeshi border by fence. So
Mm.
what do you? He says. So what do Bangladeshi people think about India? I mean, I think he's talking about the negative emotion here.
So one thing is that the borders and all will play their games all the time, right? But is that to be taken as the exactly what all the Bangladeshi people think about India? I don't think so. The kind of love I have received in Dhaka, I've been there at least 15 to 16 times. That kind of love I've received in Dhaka is absolutely incomparable. The love, I can say it with absolute no hesitation that the love and hospitality I've received in Dhaka and Lahore, any Delhiite will not be able to reciprocate that much.
I have to
You will
agree with you
not
there.
believe. You will
I have
not
to
believe it.
agree. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Shrishti Datta, sorry.
incomparable.
Please go ahead, Vishwa.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I know that one tends, it's true. I have to agree with you there, Vishwa. So I know that the gusto with which you're saying it, because it is incomparable. But Shrishti Datta Chaudhary says, and I'm only trying to get as many
Yeah.
questions answered because I don't want to run out. We have run over time, but we're not
As an
stopping.
Indian Bengali curator deal with the landless partition of 1971. Well, we have actually covered a lot of some of the stories from the 1971 partition in the book because we think it is an important part of partition. In fact, one of the best characters that I found actually in Dhaka is a man who actually stayed on in Bangladesh, in Pakistan. And even after Bangladesh was made, and he stayed on for the rest of his working life in Dhaka, in Lahore, or he was in Karachi. He stayed on his Karachi, lived in Karachi, made his money there, got his pension there, and after he retired, which was only in 90s, that he comes back to Dhaka, okay, and he sets up home in his village or whatever. He had his land or whatever. So he is a guy who's actually negotiated partition from both sides, and I've never heard a Urdu in a Bengali accent. Okay, and he was a fantastic example of that. So there are people who have negotiated things differently, and we have tried to cover these negotiations in the book. So 71 is an important part of Bangladesh. I grew up in a refugee home in Delhi, which was only dealing with 71 refugees, and I've grown up with them. Okay, so for me, it's a very important part because history continues, and history never ends. Actually,
Yeah.
the lived experience keep moving on the other in some way or the other. Yeah.
No, and I like that you say that versions of history are different because they are so connected to memory. And I think that with your work, where you restory or negotiate, in many ways, not just history through memory, that's really important because then it's not possible to detach them. It's when you detach them that they stop meaning as much as it does. Vikram Verma from our college says an extremely engaging and enriching conversation. Many thanks for putting it all together so beautifully. Both of you
There
have
was a
to.
comment. There was a comment before that the one lady said, "The daughter returns." The Purna
Oh,
Chaudhary.
that is beautiful, Purna. Yes.
So yeah, even when I went looking for my house in Bangladesh, I mean, they said, "ये तो आपका नाना बाड़ी है, आप आइए, आप बैठिए." While we were looking at it. So it's like you
It's
hear
the
in your
same
grandparents' house.
emotion even now. Yeah, yeah.
So and at the Delhi airport, I had come back with a huge suitcase because I had carried the whole Dhaka with me. So the customs guy asked me, "कहाँ से आ रहे हो?" I said, "ढाका से." So फिर क्या देखना, कल तक तो हमारा ही था. So whatever
How
his thing was,
sweet.
it was sweet. I mean, at least he
Yeah,
let
it
me go
was
to the
really
link. It was
sweet.
like, so
So you have someone, Nilima from college says that she's waiting for you to do the next book because she's not going to refuse to be a part of the collaboration. She's like, I'm already in.
Nilima,
Yeah,
Nilima
so if
did
she's
last time. So
watching,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. But Teji Ahuja says something so lovely. And I mean, I think this is the hope for so many of us that I think if the government of three countries would allow people to interact with each other more, I believe that it would heal a lot of the wounds. But they will never let that happen, keeping people apart. But, Teji,
So
I
this
think
concept of So what this concept of milne do, which is there in the book, is very important.
right,
That we have to
right.
keep the dialogues open. In fact, if you remember
Absolutely.
Coke, if you remember, Coke had done a
I
very
remember
interesting interactive machine.
fantastic
If you remember,
campaign.
that was very good. I thought we need those kind of grill or screens. Yeah,
Arpita, your publisher, is saying, thrilled to know
yeah,
that this series of talks has been started by the Partition Archive. We really need them exactly in keeping with the vision that Vishwa had when we made this side, that side. Vishwa, what's next for you?
Arpita, that's your modesty. The idea was yours, so big thank you for that. Yeah.
Tell me what's
So
next for you in terms of history and memory. Are you going to stay on the same route? Are you planning something new? I know that you're doing the
I'm
podcast. Tell us a little bit about both these exciting things that are happening right now in your life.
I'm I'm very intrigued with this concept of home in a post-COVID world. This is something I'm working on with the post-whole migration, the exodus that has happened, the kind of homes that have got lost or the homes that have got ruined or whatever. This concept of home in one's memory is something very interesting for me. This is something
Yeah.
I'm trying to explore across regions. Is the concept of home. And the other book
Yeah.
I'm really trying to work now is actually called Next Door Democracy. It's actually about
I
democracy in
love the
India,
title
Pakistan, and
already.
Bangladesh. So
Yeah, I
it's
love
about
the title.
it's just about democracy, the processing of democracy in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Stories from every day, like how do you deal with elections? Our elections are very different from their elections. Our processes of campaigning are very different from it. So how do you deal with it? So I'm putting together a lot of authors and illustrators. Hopefully, something will happen with that. There
Nilim, I
are
hope you're
risks.
listening. Yeah,
Yeah.
because he's
So
putting together a lot of illustrators. But
yeah.
Vishwa, I know that that nobody wants to tune out of this conversation, but we have run out of time. So I want to thank you so much for
Thank
being a part
you.
of this. This has been so lovely. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please consider, if you enjoyed this conversation, there are many conversations like this that happen through Sunday Stories, and you can tell the kind of work that the 1947 Partition Archive is doing to keep these stories alive. So please consider making a donation of any size, because the 1947 Partition Archive relies 100% on donations as an NGO. In some countries, donations are tax-free. The links will be in the description to this video. most importantly, it is up to all of us to keep these oral legacies alive, to keep the conversation, the dialogue open, as Vishwa said. Milne do, Vishwa, आपसे मिलकर इस virtual scenario में मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा. That's the cover of his beautiful book. Please go out and get it if you haven't got it. I know you're seeing a mirror image. I can vouch for Vishwa 100%. So if you trust me, get the book. And of course, you've heard him today. He's incredible. Great storyteller. Vishwa,
I would like to just thank the Partition Archive. I've interacted with them a couple of years. It's a phenomenal amount of work they're doing. I would also like to thank
Gunita Bhalla from the Partition Archive.
Bhalla from the Partition Archive. We have just interacted so many times. Yeah. So Gunita, thank you for the big work. And Arpita, Nishtha, Farah, thank you. This book wouldn't have happened without you. And Sonam, thank you.
Thank you all for joining in, and please tune in next Sunday. We have another exciting guest, and we'll put out the creative very soon to let you know the big surprise. Thank you so much. Good night. Take care of yourself and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.